The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet, your voice.
Welcome to BronxTalk. With the horse races of primary day and the election season, maybe the most important Bronx question might have gotten lost, and that is, what is it that the Bronx needs from the next mayor and largely overhauled city council? Regardless of who, the question is, how are we going to improve our schools, our environment, our economy, our employment numbers, our quality of life, our housing, and many other issues. So tonight we brought in a couple of Bronx elected officials who are not running this time and asked them to have an issues dialogue about what they want to see from the next mayor and city council. As for who becomes the next mayor and is elected to the council, we'll leave that to the voters. But as for discussing Bronx issues, that's for us on BronxTalk and our two guests tonight. The Assemblyman in the 80th AD, which includes Pelham Parkway, Morris Park, Allerton, Eastchester, and Van Nest. It's Assemblyman Mark Jonai. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
And from the 85th Assembly District, that includes the Bronx neighborhoods of Soundview, Hunts Point, Southern Boulevard, Port Morris, it is Marcus Crespo. Good evening, Assemblyman. Thank you for joining us. And folks, if you would like to join the dialogue, the phones are open. Please call in. Our phone number is 718-960-7241, or you can email questions or comments to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, and we'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. And before I say good evening to our guests, I want to tell you, stay tuned for the end of the show, as Assemblyman Jonai and I will be making a fun public appearance for charity. It's something you'll want to be part of, and we'll give you the details at the end of the show. One more note, Assemblyman, we want to just wish our sympathies. You had lost your father, and he wanted to mention that he's wearing a black shirt as part of his tradition in his culture and his family. That's what they do, and so otherwise he'd be dressed to the nines like me and Assemblyman Crespo. But tonight, but we do wish you, of course, and your family all good health and all the best.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, now let's roll up our sleeves. Time for Bronx issues. Both of you, independently, when we discussed the show tonight, expressed concern over voter apathy. Do you anticipate that this election season will inspire voters to come out?
Well, certainly as elected official, I've done my part, and most of my colleagues have done the same. But it's obvious that there's a disconnect, and the sentiment from the average household is simple. No matter who gets elected on Friday, Monday morning, I will have the same issues and problems to deal with. Mm-hmm. That's the true tragedy of the story.
And that's, of course, why we're here to talk about those issues tonight. As you know, that's what I'm thinking about. Your thoughts? Do you think we're going to get a turnout?
I expect better than usual because of the amount of drama and circus-like atmosphere that has been around some of these campaigns. So I expect a better turnout, but I'm also concerned because in going out and talking to voters, we've heard those concerns. We've heard the concerns that it doesn't matter who they vote for, nothing seems to change. And we've heard that, unfortunately, the headlines about some of our elected officials, colleagues who have gotten in trouble, plus also just the fact that there's so many problems, the stop and frisk issues, the education issues, the school closures, all of these things keep coming up, and voters feel as if it doesn't matter who wins, and I think that's a problem.
How do we change that? How do we change that? It's a state of mind, it seems to me, and I understand it, and I have some ideas on it as well, but what do you think?
I think there's two, amongst many things, two things that I would mention. Number one is we focus so much on voter registration, but we need a lot of voter education to go along with that, and that means efforts to really spend time with voters throughout the season, not just on election time, but even on non-election years, really discussing the importance of the vote and what it means to folks. And I think the other thing is just to really point out the full picture of how, once we get elected, what it is that's going to change the fact that we can accomplish certain things. So, for example, I tell voters all the time, I can go and scream and yell at the governor about every initiative that's important to me. But so long as the governor looks at my district and sees that it's only a 20% turnout, where other colleagues are asking for projects in communities where 80% of the voters come out, it's an easy decision for him as to where he's going to focus his attentions. And I think when I explain that to folks, they understand that turnout, more so than who they decide to vote for, means a lot when it comes to political clout.
That is a vicious cycle. Your thoughts on that?
I think the constituents have to be outraged, and in doing so, they'll get engaged. The idea of I'm not giving anyone a vote doesn't make any sense, especially when this city and this particular borough has so many needs. So it's an injustice to not only Bronxites, but the next generation, our future.
Well, let me throw something out to both of you, and that is the political climate in the Bronx. The Bronx has been clearly dominated by one political party, and I'm not only talking about the Democratic Party, I'm talking about a very specific county committee that certainly works to eliminate competition in elections and things like that. To me, that lack of competition disenfranchises voters, whereas this particular campaign was a very healthy one. As you know, on this show, we took it very seriously and invited as many candidates as we could. Is that the kind of thing you think that gets in the way? And could you recommend to leadership that, you know what, maybe we need more competition than less competition?
Well, if you recall, during the summer, we had the mayoral forum that you were so kind enough to moderate.
And you were right behind.
And it was about the Bronx vote counts. We had 23 candidates. Not all of them made it to the ballot, but 23 candidates showed up that day. And that was incredible for those that were in the audience to hear from 23 different individuals on their thoughts of where the city and the borough should be. So certainly, the more that we get involved, the more that we'll be able to reach out to constituents and engage them in voting.
You were shaking your head no when I asked the question.
No, you know what it is, that here's what stays in the back of my mind, some of the numbers. And we have you mentioned 1.3 million Bronxites, almost 1.4 million. Out of that, 500,000 are registered voters. Out of that, in the last mayoral primary, only 43,000 people came out to vote. So long as, and this is what the community needs to understand, and what I've been certainly spending quite a bit of time talking about, not just promoting the candidates I'm supporting, but just the issues in general and why it's so important to turn out. So long as we give up our opportunities, so long as we allow other people to make the decisions for us, we're going to continue to be in the back burner when it comes to getting resources, when it comes to getting the mayor to focus on our local issues. And so I think people need to understand that turnout means everything when it comes to the political clout necessary to change and to really deliver for the community.
Even in the case of a Bronx race, and there's a Bronx County Democratic Committee supported candidate and somebody else, you're saying if you really want to change, then
come out and vote. Absolutely, because
or vote for an alternative.
Two thoughts on that. Whoever wins needs to be able to speak on behalf of a community that is a high turnout community. That's going to be important. My other thought on some of these races and the number of candidates is, I'll differ. Maybe I'll get in trouble for this, but while I think competition is healthy and important, and I've watched most of the debates, but if half of those candidates that are now running against incumbents in most of the races spent an iota of their time compared to what they spend campaigning now, actually reaching out to these offices while those elected leaders were not campaigning and saying, how can we work together on this issue that's important to me, then I think the Bronx would be a better place.
Why aren't you doing X, Y, or Z?
Correct.
There's one other issue, and I've heard this from basically people were telling me, hey, can you do a show on this? And I said I would bring it up tonight, and that is these political action committees. This, Jobs for New York. The Riverdale Press reported just what I thought was an extraordinary number. They spent $175,000 on behalf of one of the candidates in District 11, which is more than either of the candidates were allowed to spend based on the guidelines. This, to me, discourages voters like crazy, because they're saying, even if I do come out to vote, or even if I'm interested in the race, it's not a fair fight. Can we do something in Albany to say, you know what, let's back off these political action committees, let's just give the voters their say, let the process, at least as we have it, play out. But having money coming from somewhere else and giving an unfair fight seems to, we'll give you both a chance. Your thought?
The true story here is that the local elections are most important for this borough and this city. I mean, the mayor's race in particular is more important to this city and the borough than the president of the United States, because it's direct contact with the needs of a borough and the city. The idea of these PAC funds that can really fall behind a candidate of their choosing is remarkable when we think about it. But it goes for both sides. You have, when you find that you have two different PAC funds, each seeking out different candidates that will best reflect their interests and meet their needs.
The point is that the money is behind, at least it appears, in this case, behind one fund, and there isn't enough funds somewhere else.
Well, you want to talk about reform then, because it's not only the
that's
PAC,
what I'm
it's
ready
all
to
about
talk
reforms entirely. Let's talk about
Can we do that in Albany?
Which we voted for. I mean, we had the campaign finance bill came up in Albany. I had a lot of concerns about that bill, and I'll tell you, I still have concerns. But looking at that bigger picture and understanding the concerns with big money coming in and determining local elections, I ended up voting in support of the bill. And so what we've seen some of the perils of that with the city finance system, where even candidates who do their darnest to make sure not to make any mistakes seem to get fined, because it's just an ad hoc system where you're dependent on whoever your monitor is to accept a voucher or something. And so there's no easy answers to it all. But look, you mentioned jobs for New York.
Jobs in New York.
And it is said that these folks are, the landlord interest that's behind some of that money. Well, it's interesting to me that some of the races they seem to be supporting are individuals who I have witnessed both in Albany and in City Hall fighting against landlord interests and protecting tenants. So I need to know more about this PAC, but I'm concerned. Look, I've been very critical of Governor Cuomo's Committee to Save New York, for example, where out of one side of his mouth he's saying we need to reform campaign finance, we need to limit special interests, but then he's taking advantage of it. So it's like, there are those that need to step up and
reforms
lead by
haven't
example.
gone far enough. They can certainly go further and tighten up that noose.
I want to ask you a question that I think I brought up at least two of the debates, and there was an editorial or a column in the Daily News today, and if I evaluate what I've been asked on this show over the course of 19 years, this is the one thing people say. I want things for my kids to do after school. There just aren't enough activities for our kids. Every single candidate that I've interviewed over the years says, we need more things for our kids to do. Yet, where does the money come from? And the budgets have been smaller than, now than probably ever before. It's out there, and I'm just going to use a phrase, tax the rich. We can get the money that way. Is that the way, I'll start with you, Assemblyman, is that the way we're going to get the money for things like this, for senior? None of you wants to close the senior center, yet the city says, you know what, we don't have any money. So the question is, when you go to Albany, is that what we're talking about, reforming the tax code so there's enough money for these things, or do we do these things in another way?
I believe this has to be a combination of both. We fought very hard in Albany for a more progressive tax system. We ended up getting a half version of that, which the governor was willing, after much debate, to side with. And we were able to increase some revenue. So I don't know how much more you can squeeze out of the tax base. There is a lot of truth to the fact that if you squeeze too much on the higher income New Yorkers, they could easily move, to another location, and there goes in terms of that. But you mentioned something of dollars in the budget for it. Once the money gets there, be made that are not necessarily in the best interest of, say, an after-school program, but rather some other initiative that the mayor believes or has believed will change things. This whole notion of closing schools, changing schools, we have doubled the size of administrations within school buildings instead of doubling the size of a number of teachers so that we can lower class size, which is going to have a much more direct impact on academic success. So there is money there. I just think they're not using it the way they should.
And there, we'll let you respond, but right there, and you can put it on your list as number one, if you're saying, what do you want to see or hear out of the mayor and the next city council? More efficiency when it comes to spending on things like youth programs. I did notice the Department of Ed today is ready to spend $13 million on some new after-school program, but that's this much,
little.
Considering
too
the
little,
size of the
too
city.
late.
What's
We're
your
constantly asking our schools to do more with less in that regard, especially when it comes to after-school programs. The reality is these schools are constructed in communities. They were built for those communities, and there's no reason for those doors to remain closed. They should be opened more than they're closed, and unfortunately we've got it vice versa. They're closed more than they're open
Where's
to the
the money
communities.
to do that?
But the money's there. The money's there. The state has passed it down from the Assembly to the Senate. We put the money into education. It's not going to the right place.
So you're looking, again, the same thing.
And that's
you're
why
looking
we're
for
so
efficiency.
excited. Not only efficiency, we're excited. I'm excited about these local elections because I truly believe, from mayor to city council to public advocate to comptroller, I think we have a great opportunity to elect a new breed that will be more conservative and wise where they spend their money.
So I'm going to be careful not to bring up the question of term limits in Albany, but that'll go for another.
You can.
No, I just wanted to add to that point. I mean, you talk about the money's there, but you know what? I'll give you an example of something the mayor has done that just doesn't speak to the need. He has spent incredible amounts of money in attorneys and his own team who went to Albany in the middle of an end of session where we had many important decisions to make, to lobby simply on the churches and schools, so non-school hours, a particular church, renting a school space. The numbers, I believe some of the revenue potential was like $1 million a year in revenue for the schools. $1 million could cover a few after-school programs in different communities. And instead, he was fighting so much and spending so much to fight that revenue because of some, ideal that, there's, anyways, we could get into that debate on another show. But there's an example of how they walked away from revenue that had been available to the schools for so long, when in fact we need so much more.
You can do more without taxing the rich is what it comes down to.
Charter schools, which again, another question that I asked in just about every debate. Would you favor raising the number of charter schools if it came across your desk? You know what, the Assembly is going to consider raising the number of charter schools. Is that a way to improve our school system?
Charter schools are here to stay, but they should adhere to the same guidelines as our public schools. I mean, they are a public school, but they're under certain circumstances, they can circumvent issues that other public schools may have to look into, especially when it comes to sharing of common areas, gyms, and rebuilding their building versus the overall school. There are certain issues there. As long as the playing field's equal, I think we'd be okay.
You mentioned it, if I'm not talking out of turn, but you talked about the UFT charter schools are not burdened, some would say, or some would say helped by, having to abide by union rules. Is that a healthy thing?
They're there. The UFT is working to make sure that it protects its members, the unions, the teachers that are working at public schools, and they're doing exactly what they have to do. They're working in the best interest of the teachers. Charter schools, they're going to continue to grow. I mean, the mayor has allocated so many more school openings, and his program is going to continue in years to come. That's why this new mayor really has to take control of this.
Your thought on charter schools?
This morning, I've been, just so you know, I've been very critical of this administration and Chancellor Walcott on a number of initiatives. This morning, I was with him at PS 93 visiting the new Icon Charter School in one of my schools, PS 93. And I was there because, as my colleague said, the charter schools are here to stay. I believe it's a great option for families. I think they have a place in our community. But I need to highlight, he mentioned the difference between the UFT teachers, but the other big difference between the traditional public schools and the charter schools is, the special education populations, the ELL population, which is a big number in the borough of the Bronx, and the fact that they don't cater to those communities in the same way in which the traditional public schools have no option but to.
So you would consider changing the rules on that?
Here's my big issue, the co-location, whether it's two public schools, a charter and a public. My problem is that if these schools can't bring resource to the table to create new school space, while we cannot create new school space, I don't know that they're the answer to our problems.
Interesting. We just got to move on. Believe me, we could talk education, but I want to get to as many different subjects as we can. Throughout the borough now, we're getting large-scale projects. We've got one going on by the Whitestone Bridge, I'm sure you're familiar with. They're talking about the old Whitestone Drive-In. There's one going on in Kingsbridge. There's actually two going on in Kingsbridge where we're talking about large-scale projects. Is this the answer or one of the answers to getting Bronxites back to work, or do you have another thought on a direction the city might go when it looks to how to invigorate the economy in the Bronx?
No, I think it is. I think it has to be a part of creating those opportunities, is creating projects right here in the borough of the Bronx. Unfortunately, we've seen in the past where projects that have come to the Bronx have been filled, those positions have been filled with non-Bronx residents. One of the things that's changed is the community benefit agreements that are being made with these developments. But I think also the simultaneous effort in preparing Bronxites. BOEDC, for example, has been very active, serving as somewhat of an HR department for some of these developments, so that Bronxites really do connect with those jobs. I think that's the coordinated effort that has begun, and I think it has to continue.
So you would support, clearly, based on what you say, you would support the CBA that was drawn up for the Kingsbridge Armory that called for more than 50% employment and procurement for the Bronx. An historic agreement. It had never been done before. Obviously, that's one of the answers.
Absolutely.
Folks, mark that down. That's number 2, one of the answers.
We welcome large-scale projects, but the true backbone of small business and job creation is the mom-and-pop shops, the commercial corridors, the Morris Parks, East Tremonts, Pelham Parkways of the districts. They're the ones that are not being catered to.
Southern Boulevard, right?
Certainly, Southern
Westchester
Boulevard, Hunts
Avenue.
Point. I mean, there's so many commercial corridors that are completely overlooked, and yet we acknowledge that they're the true backbone of the workforce. The problem is that those mom and pop shops don't have the ability to get involved. They don't have a voice. You know why? Because they're the first one in, last one out. They don't have time to follow what's coming down the pipeline. You know what time they find out about a new law or policy is when they get a violation. That's a tragedy that has to change. Large projects, we welcome them. More attention has to be paid to the small mom and pop shops.
Are commercial rents too high, like on Morris Park Avenue?
They are.
Absolutely.
They are.
That was a quick answer. Yes.
Absolutely.
They are too high, and they're reflected in the prices that the consumer pays.
And you know,
why is this so high? Let's talk about that for a moment. Something that's always overlooked, whether it be apartment buildings or commercial strips. It's because of real estate taxes and water and sewer. 2 out of the 3 biggest expenses that a property owner has are fuel, water and sewer, and real estate taxes. 2 out of 3 the city controls. So who's really controlling the rents here? The landlord or the city?
So let's put that as number 3. Go ahead.
No, I agree.
And I want to get back to you because you and I had a dialogue during the mayoral forum about the whole notion of Section 8 and rent stabilization. So you answer, and then I want to come back to that.
No, very quickly. I mean, I think he hit the nail on the head. The reality is our small businesses need a lot of help. My wife runs a small business for years, and I hear this every night from my most important constituent, my wife. It's troubling. They don't have the same protections. We talk so much, and we fight so hard to protect tenants in our communities. There's very little sometimes we can do when a small business is being squeezed out based on rents or prices. In the case of my wife, for example, the landlord decided that from now on, at a beauty salon, she was going to have to pay the water charges. That's expensive.
Salon,
that's a big expense, and so they don't have to absorb that. And there's very little that they can do. And so there's a lot of these issues. I saw a salon that came to my community, my district, and after a year of moving in and making that investment, the landlord decided he was going to extend the lease to another location, a liquor store. We don't need another liquor store in that area, and she had no choice but to move out. She hadn't yet signed a long-term lease. So there's a lot of these nuances that affect the most important constituency in business and job creation as small business.
Let's go back because, of course, your background in real estate, et cetera, et cetera. Let's talk about housing and the building of new housing. And it's interesting. I know that you support tenants, but you have concern that landlords and property owners are being priced out on their own. A lot of tenants might disagree with that. Talk to me about what needs to be done in the housing market to have a healthy housing market.
We need more affordable housing. We need more middle-income housing. The true culprit here is New York City, and I'll say it so everybody understands it. Real estate taxes and water and sewer account for almost 3 months of average rent per apartment. And I talk about large commercial buildings. It's a considerable amount. And they're the ones who raise real estate taxes and water and sewer, and the money that they collect obviously doesn't even go into the water and sewer as that agreed, but they use it to fund other programs. As these increases go up, it's a pass-along to the tenant, and yet the city's able to paint the landlord as the bad guy. I'll tell you what, you wouldn't have one landlord disagree. They would even be willing to leave rent stabilized rents flat, provided that real estate taxes and water and sewer did not increase.
What you're saying is the city keeps raising those things, and then when they get to the rent stabilization hearings, the landlords are saying, you know what, it's costing me more, and yet you're asking me to keep the rent.
They don't even have to say it. They show that it costs them more, and and the city's approach is, you're right, your expenses have gone up, so therefore you're entitled to an increase. So it's a direct pass-through.
Of course, here comes back around to the original question of, well, but we still want more senior centers and more youth programs, although we've already addressed that. It's great because we get a lot of stuff. Parks and waterfront. Now, you've got an issue which we talked about privately, potentially, about more work on Pelham Parkway, potentially endangering some of the parkland. Give me an overview of the parks in your community, and then we'll certainly talk parks and waterfront in your community. Right.
They're a true asset to my community, and they've been neglected for far too long. And not only have they been neglected, but now they're starting to take parkland away. I proposed a bill in Albany that we'd allow individuals or companies to adopt a park so they can maintain them and clean them. And the answer was no. We don't have the wherewithal to maintain our parks. But yet we don't want to allow a local organization or a community leader or a business or an individual take the burden of maintaining the park. You can't have it both ways.
What you're saying is a better communication with all these advocacy groups that are really fighting in the Bronx for their parks.
Not only fighting, they use them. They become a part of their lives. I mean, they have memories there, and they want to make sure that their children and future generations can use them and appreciate them the way they did.
Parks and waterfront in your community, obviously waterfront, a huge issue.
The next administration is going to have a tough task of dealing with the monies that are come down for Sandy recovery and meeting some of these new requirements in terms of elevations and structures and safe zones. And there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and the Bronx has to certainly be a part of that conversation. During the Sandy storm, we saw what happened in the days after, where the Bronx was almost an afterthought, and we had to fight really hard to get FEMA and other agencies to have a presence here. We cannot allow that to happen when it comes to the reconstruction.
Are the parks maintained properly? Just yes or no?
We could do better. We could do a lot better.
No.
I like the way he speaks. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Obviously, we're going to have you back, and I hope they were listening downtown, because whoever is in and whoever gets in, you heard what the Bronx needs here.
We're going to remind them of the pledges they've made to us.
Well, if the people come out and vote, then they'll definitely be.
No, we'll speak on behalf of the people. But,
Assemblyman Mark Jonai, Assemblyman Marcos Crespo, thank you so much. If you have further comments or questions on anything you heard on tonight's show, or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@hotmail.com, or make a comment on our Facebook page. We'll read those on the air during a future edition of our program. Archives of Bronx Talk are available at bronxnet.org. You click Bronx Talk on the right-hand navigation bar, and please become a fan of Bronx Talk on Facebook. Okay, now for the public appearance. You can put it up on the screen. Assemblyman Mark Jonai and I will be at Tosca, the restaurant, on Thursday, September 19th, from 6 to 9 p.m. It's a benefit for Visions Services for the blind and visually impaired. We will be so-called celebrity bartenders with a couple of other community leaders. So please come out and join us on Thursday, September 19th. It's just going to be a lot of fun. He says he'll pour the margaritas. I'll do the beers. I don't really know how it's going to go, but you're looking forward to it. We're going to have some fun, right?
I'll stir, you'll shake.
I'll shake like this. Anyway, thank you both so much for joining us, and thanks to producer Jane Folloro, director Shirley Arrieta, and to our cast of thousands behind the scenes, and we'll see you next week. Good night.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean.